Welcome to the Picky Bastards Podcast, episode 35, where we talk about mostly shit music. I'm Nick, and I'm joined by the witty, clever, thoughtful, insightful, engaging, and all-around great person, Matt Paul.
Hi.
Wow. I was wondering who was going to get that. I feel pretty lucky.
And Fran's here as well.
Yeah, I picked up on what that joke was going to be exactly the second you started talking.
And yet it still worked. Come on, give me that.
Yeah, I think maybe 3 people will laugh.
I'm one of them, though, so I don't really care.
Your mum, one of them.
That'll be good, yeah. So today we're going to be talking about 4 new albums, a classic, and one artist that at least one of us doesn't hate, which is the Why I Love introduction. So the new albums are Apollo Brown and Noir with As God Intended, Protomartyr with Ultimate Success Today, Disclosure with Energy, which is all in caps. I think that's very important to know.
Energy!
Yeah. And then Sevdeliza with Shabrang. Our classic is Jane's Addiction's Ritual de la Habitual, and I'll be introducing a playlist of Super Furry Animals. So, I'm going to start with a question for Fran, who is actually a lovely person, really, to be honest.
Thanks, Nick.
Okay, now we've mended our bridges now. So, yeah, what album came closest to bringing you towards joy, Fran?
Okay, well, as per usual, I think Nick's tried his best to make it hard for me today. Partly because he knows I rarely feel any joy. But also because this playlist in particular is quite lacking in joyful albums, if you ask me. That's not to say there weren't some really good albums, but a lot of them were quite somber and downbeat. In the end, though, I've chosen the classic from Jane's Addiction, Ritual de lo Habitual, in my wonderful Spanish. Which actually, I don't know if you know when you picked this, Nick, that it turned 30 a couple of months ago.
I didn't actually know that, no.
So in August it turned 30, so yeah, that would probably be the one that came closest to bringing me joy. That isn't to say that I loved it, but I did like it a lot more than I expected to when you picked it. I think Jane's Addiction is a name I've been hearing for years, but I didn't really know who they were, and I always imagined them to be something a little bit more heavy, something shouty that I wouldn't really click with. But little did I know I actually already knew and quite liked some of the songs on this album. Just didn't know they were Jane's Addiction, so Obvious is one of the songs, and Been Caught Stealing, which is really well known, I think. It's a great, I really like that song. It's really funky. I can tell why it's well known. I think it's a really good track. So yeah, I think it's tracks like that make me able to say this one was the one that brought me closest to any kind of joy. I think it's a kind of free, loose vibe and feels like they're having a lot of fun with the music. But because I'm not always massively into joyful music, this does wear a little bit thin for me over the course of the whole album. And I have to admit, like, my listening, I'm usually a big lyrics person, but I don't really find myself focusing on the lyrics hardly at all here. I didn't feel like they were that important, so I don't know what they're talking about a lot of the time. But I think there's some great music, and in terms of how I react to a lot of the classics we cover, I'd say this was pretty successful. I'll probably listen to more of their work, and I got more out of the album than I predicted I would, but yeah, that's kind of where I land on that one, I think.
Okay, so Matt, what do you reckon with that one?
So I think in the past we've levelled fair criticism at some hip-hop artists for sounding dated. And I think we should level that gun right at Jane's Addiction very heavily, because it is very overblown and overdriven, and the guitars are screeching all the time. And what I would say is an unnecessary way. It feels very hammy looking back at it. From our viewpoint now.
From your viewpoint?
Yeah, from my viewpoint.
Yeah.
I have listened to Jane's Addiction before. I remember they had an album come out when in like early 2000s. And I was also into the Chili Peppers, and I know they have like a shared history as well. And a lot of their, I guess, music style kind of overlaps, kind of this funky guitar driven rock music that's also poppy at times, but that said, the Chili Peppers for me are pretty dated, and these guys fall in that same category. Yeah, and so I don't really like the way the guitar's being played. I don't really like his vocals. That said,
Going downhill fast, isn't it? Really.
that said, I did quite like. I know Being Caught Stealing, like Fran mentioned, it's a great track. I think it's a good track because it's a bit more poppy and straightforward, and it doesn't sound quite as ridiculous. And the album does seem to have like two parts almost, where it is this kind of big sounds and then some quieter stuff at the end. And the transition between that is like an 11-minute song in the middle. And I quite liked that transition song quite a lot. I don't know what it was called though.
Yeah, and I can't remember what it's called. I know which one you mean though.
Yeah, I thought that was more interesting, and it was just exploring the space a little bit more, and like a jam session as opposed to these like them all just howling at each other.
So you loved it,
yeah.
all in all.
Yeah, it was interesting, and I think I don't know. It was just this playlist is kind of weird, so it was set against a weird playlist.
I mean, I can see the Chili Peppers link that you're talking about, and I mean, I know Chili Peppers. As I've got older, I've realised, they're not the most talented or interesting band, but I liked them as a teenager. So I think that's part of where I got some of my enjoyment from this album from, was the sort of, at one time I think this kind of music I did really like. So I think I was able to not really think about the datedness of it really, and just quite enjoy it. But yeah,
I think for me, I couldn't feel nostalgic about it because I hadn't really listened to them that much, and I also like the way that Dave Navarro plays guitar. He annoyed me when he was they did, was it I forgot, is it One Hot Minute?
One Hot Minute.
When he joined the Chili Peppers for a while, I didn't like that album very much.
Is he in this band?
Yeah, he's the guitarist in this band. Yeah, all the way through.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
There you go. That's why I felt that link then.
Yeah.
And I think Flea played for these guys for a while as well. So they've
Yeah.
But yeah.
So yeah, I'll jump in then. I would say overall, the style of the music. So I'll talk about the datiness for a minute. It was just to say, I think that it does suffer with some slightly irritating production problems, which are you find in quite a lot of albums, I think, of this period, which is it's very thin production. It's very sort of almost tinny in some of the points some points in the album, and so the production it doesn't really have the same kind of kick. It doesn't really hit you hard very much unless you crank the volume a hell of a lot. So some of the frenzy and rage and fury of some of the tracks where Perry Farrell's really sort of going for it vocally, you don't really get it unless you really crank it up quite loud. But when you do that, I think it actually sounds like a really interesting juxtaposition of the kind of sort of more rock and roll macho on things like the guitar side and the drum side, with the shrill kind of Perry Farrell vox, which is, I think, really, really interesting sort of mix of the two tones together. So yeah, the style is obviously really ornate, as I think both you mentioned. Like the drums and the guitar and bass play around each other, kind of move around each other a lot, which I found to be really quite energizing and intricate and fun. So I think all in all, once I got past these limitations with the production's like quality, the actual tracks and the actual energy behind the album I really enjoyed. So I'd actually say it might be one of the better classics we've done, because I would go back to it definitely, and I enjoyed most of it. Although the one I didn't enjoy was there's like that really long track, which is that one you were referring to a minute ago. Yeah. So that's the one I didn't like, because I just felt like it just went out all over the place without any real structure. So we agree on that. Yeah. So
I'm going to say that I was in the middle on that track. I'm not really sure what I think about it. So perfect consensus.
Exactly. So So no. All in all, I really really enjoyed it, and I'll go back to it definitely. And I only knew a little bit. I knew Being Caught Stealing, obviously, but not much of the rest of it really. So it was all new to me, and I'm glad I got into it.
Pretty much feels to me like you just said you like the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Nick.
I don't like the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and this band is way better than that. I know the guitar link is there, but Red Hot Chili Peppers are not nearly as good as this band, I don't think.
I think they've done. I mean, let's not get into a Chili Peppers debate, but I think like they've done some really good stuff and they've done some really terrible stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree with that. I mean, they've
that
done.
would be
I
my-
agree with the terrible stuff. I know about the good stuff, but yeah.
They've done some really good stuff. I mean, if you don't listen to the lyrics, they've done some really good stuff. But if you listen to the lyrics, I suppose if you don't mind rhyming snow with with nearly every song they've ever done, then pretty good band.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's move on then. So Matt, what album brought you closest to tears?
Yeah, like Fran, this was pretty hard.
Good.
Even
Perfect.
though it's a very dark content, I think it's fair to say the playlist was fairly dark and moody.
Right.
I know we don't normally reflect on the playlist, but I think this is why I chose this album. Is none of the albums really connected with my deep down to move me in a way that tears would be produced. And so what came closest to the feeling of that release of crying was actually listening to Disclosure with Energy. And the reason
that's an amazing choice. I can't wait to hear what you.
Fit.
Yeah, that's. I totally agree. What the hell are you talking about? Go ahead.
And the reason is it felt like a release. It felt like a big. After listening to in the context of the playlist, after listening to so much brooding and dark music, having something so bright and light felt like the release after crying.
So it's tears of joy to some extent to mix the two brushes together.
It's more like the post-cry feeling of I've let that out. It's time to move on.
That is so tenuous. Oh my god. All right, I'll let you off. Yeah.
Yeah, but it generally felt like that. This album was obviously the title is dumb, all caps energy, but it genuinely gave me energy listening to this album. It had so much, like I said, so much brightness and lightness in it, and can't divorce it from the context again of the playlist, but I found that listening to this what really changed my mood in a positive way, and so really I suggested we do this album based on the list of collaborators that were on the album.
Okay.
And I think they I haven't really listened to Disclosure much before, but the list of collaborators looked really good, and I thought they added so much to this album. For me, the high point of the album was the song with Fatimata Diawara. It reminded me musically a little bit of the best of Jamie XX. He gave lots of space and lots of room, but it felt very clean and very light. There wasn't ever, I don't feel considering it's an electronic act, it's housey music, it didn't feel like they wallowed too much in bass driven. It was very, very light, everything. And then combining that very spacious feeling that they created with her voice in that song, really her voice is fantastic, and her singing style really kind of enriched the song and added a human element to this non-human kind of atmospheric electronic sounds that they were making. And so that's why I think that applied to pretty much the whole album. They were creating this kind of very spacious beats that were not too overbearing, and then they'd have a fantastic collaborator who would then actually create a human side to the music that was really easy to connect with. That said, it wasn't a tremendously complex album. It just was very easy, accessible, and light, which I needed.
Okay, so I'll jump in, I guess. It won't be long. Absolutely no surprises here. This is a really, really solid dance album that I will never listen to again. Whatever qualities it has are not things that I can get into. And I think actually when you say that the name is not appropriate, I mean, the name is extremely appropriate and the caps is extremely appropriate. It's such a loud album. and I just found it mostly a bit grating and irritating. But I can fully understand that it's there to be danced to, and I don't dance, so
How many times have you had that line on this
I know,
podcast?
but seriously, that's what it's there for. I mean, that is the entire function of this album, is to dance. And a lot of the songs are about dancing.
Yeah.
So they're continually talking about that. So fair enough, go for it. But it just doesn't work for me. So I thought there were a couple of moments where it sounded like it had little hints of like Aphex Twin in it in some of the slightly more glitchy stuff, like in My High, for example.
Yeah.
You know, I enjoyed that more than the rest of it, but in general, it just kind of didn't get any traction on it, and it just went past me, really. Yeah, so not something I was falling in love with, really. But yeah, Matt, Fran, what do you think?
Well, unsurprisingly, I wasn't particularly excited when Matt chose this album, but there is a reason for that. My only previous experience of Disclosure wasn't really a very good one. I was at a festival in Lisbon, which they were headlining, and their sub-headliner that evening was The National, which, you know, it's a bit of a weird mix. And I just watched an amazing set from The National, and I didn't know who Disclosure were. I was very drunk, so I thought I'd hang around and just see what they were, and I really quickly wished I hadn't, because it was not my thing. So I wasn't very excited, but then I looked at the track list, and like Matt said, there's some great people featured on it. There's Slow Tie, Khalees, Mick Jenkins, Common. They're all artists that I really like. So I allowed myself to get a little bit excited. And then I listened to it, and it's really quite hard for me to think of another album as drab and soulless as this one. The only thing that comes close to me that I can remember us doing on the podcast is the Noel Gallagher album from a couple of years
Oh, I
back.
remember that one, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
In a weird way, this album kind of reminded me of that. And the reason is it's just full of drab, cliched lyrics over beats that all sound pretty much identical. And I think this album really feels like it's saying a lot, when actually almost everything it says feels like it's from the advertising flyer for a self-help seminar. Like, the worst offender is the title song, where some prick spends 5 minutes telling loads of people living in a pandemic that all they need to do to stop feeling negative is to change their thinking and watch where their energy flows. I think this song's like just short-sighted as fuck. But on the main part, the album's just really, really boring. Like, it's really dull. So many of the songs sound the same. Matt, your point about the guests is, like, I was excited by this, but Slow Tie is so dumbed down on his song that they make him, the production makes him sound so just generic and uninteresting. Like, I cannot understand why anyone would like this album.
Really? See,
Yeah,
I in my head, I was comparing it more to, like, you know, when Dizzy Rascal did all his features, and he still does with more dance music producers. They were still great songs. They're just not a Dizzy Rascal song.
But if you listen to what they do to his voice, or even what they do to Slow Tie's voice on this, it just sounds very metallic and very sort of dumbed down, and it's just not interesting. I think this is one of the most boring and soulless albums I remember listening to be honest.
Nice.
So that's where I landed.
Wow. That could be a problem then, yeah. So
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on. Maybe we should go back to Fran and see what you thought was the best of the rest of the albums.
Okay, I'm going to go with Sevdeliza, Shabrang, although I will say it's quite hard for me to choose, but I think I'll go with that. There are a couple of albums I want to talk about in relation to Shabrang. The first one's FKA Twigs' Magdalene. I think there were some real similarities between the two in terms of sort of the dark, brooding tone and the sparse instrumentation that's then like littered with little elements of experimentation and some surprising twists and turns. I think this album's less experimental than the Twigs one, but for me, in the end, I think that also makes it a more successful and enjoyable album across the piece. I think Magdalene has a lot of peaks and troughs, and its peaks might be better than the peaks on this album, but I think this album's more consistently good. And then weirdly, the other album I want to compare it to is one that we all slated on the podcast. Do you remember Chelsea Wolfe's Birth of Violence?
Yep.
Yeah. So if you can remember back to that episode, we all sort of seemed to agree that there was like this artificial sheen of darkness over the album, loads of cliched representations of evil, and I think in Shabrang there's some similar themes. It's always focusing on good and evil for most of the album, but I think the execution is just much more impressive. There is a similar sheen of darkness over the album, but it feels really real, and I think that's why it's so compelling. So yeah, I thought it was an outstanding album. I think the strings and the piano throughout are just really atmospheric. I think they really come to the fore in the song Habibi, which is one of my favourites and one of the ones that most reminds me of FKA Twigs. Um, and I think that song also signals a bit of a switch in the album. It's followed by the song Dormant, which is a really gorgeous track, kind of trip hoppy, a little bit Portisheady it felt to me, and a little bit Massive Attack.
Yeah,
I just
definitely.
think that's a fantastic song, and yeah, you can really hear them in it, I think. And yeah, from then on, from those, the early songs take a little bit of time to get going, but once it does get going, everything is really a misfire. I think Wallflower's great, Darkest Hour's great. It's like Darkest Hour is almost this dark, intense track, but almost a club track as well. And then I love it how she switches up on Oh My God, which feels like an R&B track. I feel like in some ways that song shouldn't work, but it really does. So yeah, I love this album. It's I think one of my favourite discoveries in quite a while.
Shall I jump in?
Go for it.
Yeah, so for me, I don't want to patronise, but does everyone know this expression in the box, production in the box? You know this? Yeah. So this album is really immaculate in many ways. It's so like perfectly produced, and that's really the best thing about it and the worst thing about it in some ways, because
Yeah.
there are times when, so I'll talk about the negatives first and just get them out of the way, which is there are times when it seems like it can be too sterile, too so clean that it feels lifeless, which obviously coming out of the Disclosure is, and it was right after it in the playlist as well. That's also a fairly lifeless album and by that measure. But in this genre where you're trying to be more emotive, which I got that sense, this is a problem sometimes. I think actually I know Wallflower is a really beautiful melody, but I think Wallflower is one of the biggest problem songs in this regard. It's quite a clinical sound that can sometimes seem flat for that reason. But at the same time, I think In the Box gives a lot of flexibility and it gives a lot of clarity to the songwriting. And I think there's some great tracks on this album. There really are. So I think that my favourite track is probably Road, quite near the end, which I think is absolutely fantastic. Habibi is really good in terms of a vocal performance. Lamp Lady is great. So, and her voice throughout is extremely beautiful. So I think all in all, I did really like the album. I worried a little bit sometimes that it went down the road of being In the Box a long way, but sort of down the rabbit hole with that. But fundamentally, I thought it was a great piece of work, and certainly I'm pleased I came across it. And I've been listening to it probably a lot. I don't know more than everything else on here, but a lot. And I'll continue to do so. I think it's one of the better things I found about this year. So yeah, no, really, really, really enjoyed it. Yeah. So Matt, what do you think?
Yeah, I can echo a lot of the sentiments you guys have already brought up. It's a really good album. I did find it funny. So when I first listened to this, the very heavy acoustic guitar twang in the first track kind of caught me off guard, because I was expecting some weird alt R&B album, and it made me think of early noughties alt rock. And I thought we were going to start with Puddle of Mud or something. But that, it obviously quickly switched away from that. And I have a lot of the same comparisons as Fran brought up. I wrote down Portishead for Dormant. I also wrote down FKA Twigs. I think that's an obvious one. I'd say some of her singing style actually reminded me of Rosalia. It was almost flamenco-esque, especially accompanying this kind of idea of contemporary genre-bending R&B at times. And so that was obviously really great to hear and interesting, because she's a huge artist at the moment who's doing fantastic things. I think the other comparison I had was All Rivers at Once sounded like a Radiohead song. I don't know if I expected you to pick up on that, Fran.
No, I didn't.
But to me, even her singing style was aping Tom York in a really interesting way, but it was putting the kind of stylings and the way that a Radiohead song would evolve in obviously a different context.
Interesting you say that, because
I like that song.
I do think the way in which she changed the tone of her voice through all the different songs in the album, or through lots of the different songs in the album, was really good, really effective, and really powerful.
Yeah.
That's why I picked Road Up particularly. I thought that was one where she sounded so different from the rest of the album. But I see what you're saying about that track. It's she's really willing to take risks like that, which I think is great.
I think the fact that we can compare it to so many things, and they're all good things, really goes to the big strength I find in this album is there is a common thread, but it keeps evolving and morphing with not just every single track, but every single moment. And that made it almost kind of slippery to hold on to, but it was always there, and I found it really an interesting lesson. I guess the only criticism I have is because it was something that I was avidly trying to keep up with, essentially, it's quite long. But that's one of those things that was too much of a good thing.
It is quite long. I think because some of the last 3 songs, I think I probably heard a lot less than I heard the rest of the album, because it was rare that I would have the time to sort of listen to the whole thing in one sitting. So I think it's a shame in a way that it is that long. But it's not. When we talk about long albums, sometimes, and I can immediately pick what songs we should take away, I would struggle to do that here, I think.
Yeah, I do think the way it evolves over time gets less interesting though. But that
I thought it ended really
also...
well. I thought the last 2 or 3 tracks, which included that Road I was going about, were all really, really strong. Yeah,
I think it ends better than it starts, but it's just sometimes I wouldn't get as far as the end, unfortunately, because it is quite a long album. But most of my favourite stuff is after the first sort of 3 or 4 songs. So maybe just take away those. There you go. Yeah. I fixed it.
Done.
Nice. Sorted it for her.
Cool.
So, so I will jump in then and talk about Protomartyr.
Okay. Cool.
So I think when I first listened to this album, I didn't really warm to it, because it felt like it was really trying to be the Bad Seeds with slightly more distorted guitar, like cross between Grinderman and Bad Seeds, and the singing was kind of like Nick Cave light. It was like a kind of diet version of that, which I don't think, on reflection, is fair. So it took a while for me to get past that sense that it was ripping something off that I preferred. But I think in the end, it's a really strong album. It has some really excellent stuff on it. The Aphorists and June 21 are both a little bit sinister, a little bit somber, and then thoughtful with like these bursts of anger. And I thought all that stuff was great, and I don't think it was as consistent as the Sevdeliza, but I thought it had a lot of really high points. And I think it showed a lot of restraint, a lot of delicacy through a lot of it, which gave more dynamic range for it to kind of suddenly burst into bits of frenzy, which I think June 21 is the best example of. I really enjoyed it, and it made for another sort of high point on this playlist. I won't talk about the whole playlist yet, but it certainly carried the playlist along very well. It was very strong. So I really enjoyed it. So that's all I have to say on that one. Matt.
Cool. Yeah, I'm in danger of agreeing with you too much.
Can't have that.
It did have that kind of macabre tone of Nick Cave, but like you say, I don't necessarily think it's a detriment. He has such a unique voice that there can be multiple people that operate in that space without it just being him. And that dark tone is obviously carried forward in the music as well, and use the term dynamic range to talk about like the energy in the music. But I also thought they also did that with there was a lot of the music was this kind of dark, thick wall that was kind of attacking you and enveloping you, and the way that they then had some of the brightness of the guitars at points really cut through that in a way that I did very much enjoy. And I think, did we cover the previous album?
We covered the previous album. I feel like it was before your time though. I felt it was while we still had
Maybe.
Normal on.
Maybe.
Don't expect me to
I
remember
listened
that,
to you
surely.
guys.
That was more than 2 months ago. I'm not going to remember that. Forget it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was
But
Relatives in Descent. It was called, and yeah, we covered. I think it was on one of the festival because they were playing at a festival I was going to, so I think that's why we covered it.
Yeah, and so I definitely enjoyed it more than that because I do think the idea of this dynamic range, they had more going on, and it had just more depth to the music itself. I also picked out June 21st as a highlight track because I really enjoyed the second vocalist again because it added depth to the music. I think the thing for me is after that June 21st, it tailed off, and I was less interested towards the end of the album. But overall, I think they managed to create a really interesting, like, doom-filled atmosphere that was so much more than what I'd heard from them before, which sounded more just a group of people with some guitars and drums. It sounded bigger.
Right. Nice. Okay, Fran.
So for me, I think I suffered a little bit from having my expectations raised. I picked this one, and I picked it because it was recommended to me by so many different people that I was expecting to fall in love with it straight away. I think there must have been 6 or 7 people who told me to check it out, and some of them people who don't normally talk to me about music, and it was just really random, so I had to pick it. And at first, I couldn't really see what the fuss was about. I thought it was decent, and I really liked the last album, but I didn't see a massive step forward. But I think part of the problem for me anyway is that the album doesn't have the strongest of starts, and the opening song remains the one that I'm least interested in. But the song did really grow on me over time. I think there's a run of songs in the middle, which I think you guys have all mentioned at least a couple of them, but it starts with The Aphorist, runs through June 21, Michigan Hammers, and Tranquilizer. I just think it's exceptional, and I think that's such a great run of songs. Really strong. We've all said dark, we've all said brooding, and I think those words are coming up a lot today. But it is really brooding and intense at this part of the album, and I think I get really drawn in. And I think there's some really interesting bits of music in there. The addition of some brass instruments really gives it something extra. But in the end, I think it's an album that doesn't start brilliantly or end brilliantly, but has a fantastic middle section. So I like them best when they're like this, they are brooding and dark, and they are all the way through the middle. And if everything was as good as that middle part, I think it would be one of my favourite albums of the year. But I don't think that everything is as good as that. So in the end, it's kind of it's a good album that I don't love because I think it's a bit weighted in the middle. But yeah, it's still very good. So
Okay. So that just leaves Apollo Brown. So Matt, why don't you start?
First thing to say about that is it's Chez Noir, which annoyed the hell out of me on Spotify. Apollo Brown is the
producer.
The producer,
right?
I did say
Chez
Apollo
Noir.
Brown and Chez Noir together when I introduced them at the start.
Yeah, so Chez Noir's the rapper. I meant to point that out to you guys in case you hadn't picked up on it before we spoke, but yeah, Chez Noir. It annoys me because on Spotify it always says it's Apollo Brown,
Yeah,
and it's not.
yeah.
So.
I hunted around a little bit to find her actually. Yeah, so I know what you're saying.
So
yeah.
just
So
to
Chez
get that point
Noir
across.
with Apollo Brown in parentheses.
Yes.
Yes. Go ahead, Matt. What do you reckon?
Okay. I didn't really, because I obviously knew that Chez Noir was the rapper, but I thought it was more, obviously the production is maybe more involved or something, because...
Well, if you look at her old albums, she's got, each one is with a different producer, and she does use the name in the title, and all the titles now on Spotify are the producer's name and not hers, which I'm not sure how that's happened, but
Gosh.
yeah, it's a bit annoying, but anyway.
Well, yeah, to get down to it, I think this was a really interesting album. I think it has a really obvious, like it's very obvious, it has a very classic hip hop vibe. It wears that influences very, very like visibly on its sleeve. Even has the track 1994, which is just all about its influences, what she grew up listening to and what she respects within hip hop. And so it's completely, I feel like, ignoring what is current right now. But that said, that isn't necessarily a bad thing. There's obviously space for everything, and it's done in a more modern way. And so it does still sound kind of fresh, even though they're still doing the the classic like filler pieces of like Yes Yo and It Don't Stop, like that everyone used at the time, and it has that kind of the same like vitality as that kind of the golden era of hip hop in the 90s, but it still manages to, I think, sound relative like pretty fresh and interesting. It doesn't sound dated because I don't know. I guess they're using modern production techniques. I don't know. But I think her flow throughout it's fantastic. It's very slow and deliberate. It's very considered. And then obviously the content is like she is a very good storyteller. I think for me the highlights are around tracks 3 to 5. And in the 5th track, she really shows her storytelling at her best when she's telling this tale of like going out with her friend, and then she feels like she's betrayed, and then something goes down, and it's interesting. I feel like that story is really interesting because it highlights almost the pointlessness of violence, but then there is like a lot of talking about. How she's gonna, I don't know, attack someone in other songs. So it reminds me of listening to stuff like Biggie, where there is almost a recognition of the current state of things and almost a hypocritical nature of recognizing the negativity, but then also reinforcing it at the same time. But overall, yeah, I enjoyed this album. I thought it was very good. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so why doesn't Fran go next and I'll come in at the end?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Matt's just read my notes. So, not going to say loads of different...
We're meant to be each other's throats the entire podcast, Rose. That is the point of this exercise.
I know,
so what the hell are we doing?
At least we got to fall out on Disclosure.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, that album is more likely to make you cry than this album, Matt. I mean, sort your life out. Really.
Yeah, that is a bit of an odd one. I can see his point.
For me, to start talking about the Noir album, I'm also going to have to begin by talking about the song 94, which Matt's already mentioned. It's one of my favourite songs on the album. It's the last song. I feel like it gives a really good benchmark for what this album's all about. So, yeah, she talks about a lot of hip-hop from 1994, and it's a lot of stuff that, I wasn't listening to hip-hop in 94, I was 10, but a lot of the stuff that she talks about in that song is stuff that I got into in the next few years after that. And then as she goes through the song, she starts to talk about G-Unit, who were big in her generation, which, G-Unit were massive when I was really into hip-hop. And while she never mentions Dr. Dre, I think that Apollo Brown's beats on the album are a huge debt to him. This sounds a lot like many of the Dre-produced albums from back in the day. I don't think that's a bad thing, though. As Matt said, I think hip-hop's always been a genre that sort of has innovators alongside people who stick to the sort of tried and tested formulas. And I think this is a really good example of the latter. I think the beats, as Dre-like as they are great, and the flow and lyricism are really strong. There's a lyric in an early song called Hustle Don't Give that really grabbed my attention when she says, I had to grow up in violence, money talks could turn your life into a moment of silence. Well, that's a fantastic lyric, really clever, and sort of shows what she's about. And I was just going to go into a bit of a spiel about 12 Hours, which is the song about shooting a partner, which Matt's just mentioned, but I won't, because Matt's pretty much said it all. But I think that song is like a full-on short story. I think it's very clever, and I think it definitely does talk. It is a highlighting the pointlessness of violence and the sort of, I think, the easy access to guns and all that kind of thing. It really comes across in that song. She mentioned Biggie in the song 94, and I see a lot of parallels in both the stories and in her style. So yeah, I think I would have definitely picked this as the album that brought me closest to tears. But I think what's saddest about this album really is that the same stories that needed to be told by the likes of Biggie and Pac back then in 94 still need to be told now. If you listen to songs like Daddy's Girl, The Apple, and Freedom, they all focus on race relations and police brutality and actually, things that haven't really changed. And I think it's an incredibly strong album for these reasons, even if it doesn't really feel fresh. I think what I was left thinking is that it's hard to be really fresh when this is your subject matter, because society hasn't progressed and things are still the same. So she's rapping about things that, haven't changed and were, some of it very close to what Biggie was saying on Ready to Die, which we covered on the podcast as a classic.
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, I thought it was a really interesting album. I really enjoyed it, but it also made me want to cry because it is really sad. So,
It is. So I really enjoyed this album in the end, but for some reason it took me a long time to make a connection with it. I think there was nothing about it that was bad when I first heard it. I thought it was generally interesting, well produced in a sort of traditional hip hop production style, which we talked about already. But I just didn't grab me for a long time. I think partly I was actually, this is funny to say, but I was hung up on the song. Is it 12 Hours? That's the one you referred to, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I found to be the weakest song on the album. Honestly, I felt like the narrative was okay, but it didn't seem to have the weight of a lot of the other tracks and a lot of the other subjects in the tracks. And I also I found it kind of a little bit trite the way at the end when she shoots him and then she says, "Oh shit," like fuck, it sounded really like emotionless, honestly, in terms of delivery of that, which I can see what you're saying about it being a narrative about violence and the perpetuation
I think
of
that's
violence.
Purposeful, but I can see.
Yeah,
I think it took me a while to get that. To get that and to click with that, because I think at first I felt like when I wasn't listening too closely and you just hear that last bit of the verse, I think sort of, oh yeah, of course she shot him, sort of thing. But the more I listened to it in the context of the album, the more I started to get a bit more of an emotional reaction to it, I think.
Maybe I should give it more time then. Maybe I should give it more time then. I mean, I did listen to it quite a bit, and I do overall like the album. But again, I find it really hard to read, and I find it really hard to find the vocabulary for what didn't grab me immediately. Maybe it was that I was concerned that it was dated. And I think the point that Fran makes about it being a narrative that still needs to be told is really interesting, valid point. So yeah, I mean, I don't know what else to say about it really, except that in the end I warmed to it a lot. I felt like her flow was really aggressive, but really thought out at the same time, which I think I generally really enjoyed. But yeah, that's whenever I think of the album, I can't help but thinking about 12 Hours. I don't know why that's just stuck with me so much. Not just the end point of it, but the general tenor of the song and the narrative. It didn't seem to carry enough to be worth all that attention on my part, which is my mistake maybe. I don't know.
I think what's quite interesting about that song and what maybe is what's happening for you is it's the one that, a lot of time in hip hop songs are, exaggerations or they are fictions, but we don't know for sure if they are, whereas that one clearly is. It clearly is not something that actual event didn't happen.
Yeah.
And that's quite apparent. Whereas a lot of the stuff throughout the rest of the album, it feels very real. It feels very believable. Whereas that song, you can tell it is a bit of it's a trope and it's an attempt to say something, but it is a short story. So I think maybe for me that was why it stood out a little bit at first, as it felt very different to the rest of the songs. But in the end, I did grow to enjoy that rather than to see it as a problem, even though it did stick out for me for quite a while as well. So.
Yeah,
I don't think it's everything about that song is distinctive. Just even the beats behind it is very angular and weird sounding, and it does stick in your head. So like it's not surprising that it sticks out, and maybe you analyze it more than maybe some of the other ones.
Maybe. Yeah, it could be that. But yeah, I mean, in the end, I'm not saying I didn't enjoy it. I'm just saying it took a long time for me to enjoy it. And I got hung up on some things, which maybe, again, is my problem, really. Yeah, so...
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting things about it as well, though. Like, and it does come back to what I was saying about, it's a lot of the stories and a lot of what she talks about are things that we hear on albums a lot, right? The song Freedom, where it's, freedom ain't free, and there's snippets of speeches about police brutality and murders of Trayvon Martin and stuff. It's become something that's just in so much hip hop now that this album is, because it feels quite old in its stylings. I think that stands out, but it is you can't. It's hard to expect someone to tell any different stories when they live in that situation. So it's that weird thing of like, okay, we're hearing these stories again, but actually those stories are really important and need to be told. It's not like it's not like the trope of fucking love songs by boy bands or anything. It's a trope that needs to exist, but can sometimes be difficult when I suppose we listen to quite a lot of hip hop albums on here, so we do come across those themes quite a lot. But yeah, so it's interesting.
I think maybe it was that mix of like vintage style production with what are themes which came out in songs 20 years ago, as well as all the way through the intervening time, was hard to digest. But yeah, in the end, I did think it was a really good album. So before we move on to the Why I Love stuff, what do people think of this playlist as a whole? Matt?
I like I really liked the majority of the albums apart from Jane's Addiction. I think that's clear from the way I've talked about them. But I did find it a bit of a slog in the terms of it is very broody and dark, and it was hard to get through at times because it was so intense. But this is some of my favorite albums this year, maybe. I don't know.
Right. So I'll go with Intense then, because to me this was the best playlist we've had in ages. It up there with the best we've had of all, because really Disclosure is obviously, as I've said, the one that I didn't connect with, but I still respect what it was attempting to do in its genre. So, and the other 4 albums I think were all really good. In different ways. It was varied in that respect. There were a lot of different styles in it, although I agree that it was quite sinister through most of it. But yeah, so I loved it. It's been one of the few ones where I was willing, by the time I got to the end of near the time of recording today, where I would actually put it on random on those 6 albums, that and the Super Furries we'll talk about in a minute, and not be skipping things endlessly. Although I had to periodically for Disclosure, but not that much, for the others. So that's very, very rarely happened. Generally, there's one album I would say is my average. One album I really get into, and the others are either not that bothered or actually actively dislike. So it was a big winner for me, honestly. Yeah. So Fran, what did you think of the playlist altogether?
Yeah, I think it's strong. I mean, I despise the Disclosure album, which is a big sort of. There's sometimes you get those playlists where there's everything's okay or one thing's really good, but that album was I never wanted to listen to it. The Jane's Addiction I enjoyed more than I thought I wouldn't come back to, probably, but the other 3 really strong albums, and I think part of the problem I had for a while was the fact that it is quite, we're going to use the words brooding, dark and intense again, seems they're the words of the day, but I think it took me a while actually to realise how much I like those 3 albums. I think all of them had to grow on me because it was quite heavy listening sometimes, but in the end, I think it's up there. It's certainly in the top half of our playlists ever, definitely, and probably higher than that. I was impressed.
So it's a winner, which is why we ended up being not as aggressive and negative to each other, because it was actually quite a positive playlist in some ways.
Yeah,
Disclosure was fucking shit.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay. Well,
okay. Just to get some negativity in there.
We'll just agree on that one. Yeah. So no, it was. Yeah.
One day.
Wasn't for me. Okay. So
one day I'll make you dance.
No, you won't.
I like loads of dance albums. That's not a dance album. It's a sit and stare at your own face and tell yourself how wonderful you are album.
That is so tenuous. I don't know what the hell you're talking about anymore with that comment at the end there. It's like, what? Stare at your own face? Anyway.
It's just people who love themselves making noises.
I see. Right. Okay. Fair enough. All right. So I am going to jump into the Why I Love section, which is this month, about the Super Furry Animals. And I'll start looking at my notes. I'll basically say that I wrote in caps, "This is one of my all-time favourite bands," as the very first bullet point, as if I didn't know that myself. So, so I just wanted to remind myself, this is one of my all-time favourite bands. And it certainly is. And I want to try and explain why, but I think I'm a little bit liable to get overexcited and not make a lot of sense. So I'm going to try and distill it down into what
I
this
think I've ever
album
heard you overexcited.
is what this playlist is really about. So for me, this is as simple a list as I can put down. Really, there's no band, there's no set of songs like this that have more joy in them than this playlist. There's none with more absurd humour in them. There's none with more beautiful harmonies, I would say. And there's none with as great an awareness of the full frequency spectrum. In other words, everything the sub bass frequencies all the way through to the highest sort of thin, tinny and airy sounds. They really, really care about that stuff. And there's nothing really, or there's very little in guitar music at least, with any more complex arrangements. For a 5-piece band, they make exceedingly complicated songs at some points, and I think that's kind of amazing. So the original playlist I put together for the best stuff of this band was over 3 hours long, as Fran knows. And that just to me speaks to how incredibly consistent they've been over so many albums. I mean, the last album is not as good, I don't think, and I didn't include anything from that in point of fact when I got down to the chopping down process to only a measly 18 songs. But in the end, they are so consistent, and they have this amazing mix of like super heavy guitars, which are put in a tiny, kind of hilariously tiny box. They have this like massively distorted, overdriven sounds that they've boxed off into this tiny space, which I find amazing. They have these beautifully lush harmonies. I talked about that a minute ago. They have the kind of big rock drum beats, the kind of progressive rock drum beats, which are massive and sit over everything. And then they have these electronic elements, which are really kind of come out of left field, I think, and only developed more as they got further into the career of the band, to albums like Gorilla, which were much more electronically orientated than some of the first sort of 2 or 3. And it's all woven together. All these elements are woven together so meticulously. I think it's just really remarkable to see that they can pull that off across what is it, 6 or 7 albums. So I think really maybe the best way to summarize it is that they're a super weird band. They really are an oddball band, and that goes from things like the kind of aura of madness around them, and then also into their music. So I don't know, I'm sure people have heard, and you probably are aware about the buying a tank to have a PA system strapped to a tank to go to festivals, so that the PA couldn't be confiscated by the police. So they also when I saw them in New York City, actually they played the entire set dressed as Alsatians, which I just kept thinking to myself, how are they not fainting in the heat in here? It's unbelievable. Yeah. They actually played a sort of double top of the bill playlist with Grandaddy. And every night alternated between who was top of the bill. And the night I saw them, they were in support to Grandaddy. And to be fair, I love Grandaddy, but to be fair, they blew Grandaddy out of the water. It was kind of a little bit sad afterwards when they came on. So that's kind of crazy as well. But yeah, so it's not just a media show though. The music is really, really odd. And there are some good examples I've put together. So one would be, and not all of these are on the playlist in the end, unfortunately, because there were so many songs I could refer to. But Run Christian Run, if Rings Around the World, is a long track which appears at the end of Rings Around the World, one of the albums that I featured. And it's nearly 10 minutes long. And the entire song is built around a single synth ping, which kind of pops through the track. And they build an entire kind of massive, sort of majestic string section, multiple guitars, multiple harmonies over this little pinging sound, which then at the end of the song reappears, as it were, as you can hear it more clearly through the rest of the stuff dying away. That's a kind of incredible piece of production work. They have songs which are lyrically really bizarre as well. There's one that I recall about powering Gruff wanted to power his house using a hamster in his wheel in the wheel, so he does a whole song on the first album called Fuzzy Birds about that, which is pretty wild really as a concept for a track. And then I think one of the best examples actually is of the kind of weirdness is Night Vision, which I'm pretty sure is on this playlist. I think it was. Where the song kind of collapses into a sort of, this is what I talked about the wide frequency range I was talking about earlier. It collapses into a sort of super sub bass breakdown section, which unless you have either really good bass end stereo or just really good headphones or whatever, you can't even hear some of this track on cheap stuff sometimes. It's so rumbling and growling, and then the song kind of rebuilds itself over the next minute or two into a normal track. That is some left field thinking from a production standpoint. I mean, I don't understand how they came up with the idea of writing a song which then dies in the middle, only to be replaced by something in the sort of 50 hertz range, and then build it all like up again to a full track. So I love that stuff. So so playing the playlist through and putting the playlist together was itself a really joyous act. And I think overall, I'd just say that anyone who thinks that I'm a miserable bastard can go fuck themselves because his playlist proves that I am full of joy. So, yeah, that's all I wanted to say about it. I don't know what you want to both put into that. Fran, what did you think of this playlist?
Okay, so the last Why I Love You did was the horrors, I think. And interestingly, I'd say my reaction to Super Furry Animals is quite similar, in that there are parts of the career I really, really enjoyed, and other parts that I wasn't as into. For the Super Furries, I'd say for me, it's the early stuff that really appeals to me the most. The first 3 tracks, particularly from the first album, are probably my favourite 3 on the playlist.
Okay. It was 3 per album, I think I did it. So that's
Yeah,
all
I think
from
so.
Fuzzy
Yeah.
Logic. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think particularly, I already knew. Hearing back, I already think I'd heard all 3 of them, but I knew If You Don't Want Me to Destroy You very well because weirdly it was on one of those best indie album ever things that I had when I was like 15, and I loved it. And
I'll just point out that lyric was written down the barrel of the tank. On the tank,
really?
PA tank system used to drive across festival sites.
Nice.
It had "If You Don't Want Me to Destroy You" written down the side of it in big white letters, which is fantastic.
Amazing.
Yeah, go ahead.
I really still like that track, and I would say probably. I mean, it's hard when you know a track that well for me to then pick anything else from the playlist that I liked more than it. But I think that's amazing. I really like a couple from the next album. I like Demons a lot, and there were a couple of later songs I like. I liked Sidewalk Surfer Girl. That's one example.
Yeah.
But there's other stuff around the middle that I'm a bit less keen on. I wouldn't say I dislike any of it. Like I think it's all pretty good. But one thing that really struck me, and you've kind of almost touched on it already, Nick. But one word I would use to describe this band is a word that you always use on the podcast as a negative. They're very chirpy. They're extremely chirpy, and you normally hate chirpy. Which is interesting to me.
I think chirpy refers to a frequency thing as well, though, like tinny or painfully, annoyingly upbeat. I don't know. It's not an emotional thing to me. It's a musical thing. But anyway, go ahead.
I mean, I think they are musically chirpy, though. I think that's the sound is very chirpy, and I'm not saying that necessarily as a negative. It just struck me that that's something you usually aren't as keen on. So I can't remember what the name of the album, but there's the tracks The Turning Tide, Northern Lights, and Night Vision.
That's
probably
Mung, the Welsh album.
Okay.
It's the whole
Welsh language album, though. That's not the Welsh language album, is it?
Is it not? Or is it Gorilla?
No, it's the one before that.
Oh, Gorilla then. Yeah, Gorilla.
That was probably the stuff that I was less into.
Oh, that's my favourite one of all of them. Out of every single one, that's my favourite one.
I do think sometimes when they bring a bit more electronics in there, that's when it gets a little bit less interesting to me. I did feel that sometimes it didn't feel like it belonged, but that's just me.
Being wrong, yeah, I understand.
And another thing, it's interesting, quite a few of the bands that you've introduced and Why I Love, I've liked, but I've always thought I probably would have liked them a lot more then.
If I hadn't introduced them.
No, they're like bands that I feel I can see why you love them, and I think maybe you know when you fall in love with a band and then you like them forever, and I feel like if I'd listened to them as much as you did back then when my music taste was a little bit different, I would have liked them. If that makes sense, I would have liked them a lot more. But I think these are clearly a much more inventive and interesting band than a lot of the music I was listening to when they were around, so I'm definitely not slagging them off.
Yeah.
The last thing that struck me, and I'm not sure whether you're going to see this as an insult or not, I hope not.
Here we go.
It's how similar they sound to Blur.
Okay.
Quite often I had to remind myself that it wasn't Blur I was listening to, and I loved Blur back in the day, so again, it's not an insult.
It's interesting when you say about 2 things about that. So on the Blur thing, I mean, I can see that they're of the 90s as well in lots of ways. I'll just say that in terms of the freshness of it, though, I was really pleasantly surprised myself by how much joy I could still get out of these songs even after this amount of time. Yeah. And not just nostalgia, but really a sense that it still had so much to offer to me.
Certainly, it's really interesting. Like I said, they're really interesting, really inventive. They're definitely original, but Blur, they do really remind me of Blur.
The quirkiness of Blur is there's a little bit of that quirkiness, although they don't go quite as insane. But I think song production-wise is where it differs. Is the complexity of the song production is massively higher in the Super Furries than Blur. Blur is a guitar band that does some good stuff. I'm not slating them. I'm just saying that that's their framework. And I don't think Super Furries are fundamentally like that by the end. Anyway, if you look at an album like Gorilla we were just talking about, that's an electronica album, or the Welsh folk album Mung they did. So anyway, go ahead.
But no, that's pretty much all I had to say. I think it's It's certainly not a negative. I just think there was highs and lows for me, but yeah, one of those that I think I can certainly see why people love this band, and I think I would love them more if I'd just discovered them earlier. Really.
Okay, Matt, what do you think?
Cool. Yeah, so I think I have a similar relationship with this band to Fran. Like I've heard some of these tracks before through like alternative album compilations that I bought,
Right.
and I'd liked them, but never like gravitated towards them, and then become a fan at the time. And I think some of that is just because of the style of music isn't something I generally gravitate towards. The kind of big, rich. It's very warm and fuzzy and feels very human throughout, I think. And that's compared to something like, say, like Disclosure, right? It's very different in the sense that it does sound like it has this very vital heartbeat underneath it. And that's never been something that really grabbed me in the past. Like the fact that it is very like you have this very gentle distortion on the guitars and a very gentle like his voice is also kind of gruff. And
Did you do that on purpose then?
Yeah, well done.
No, I realized afterwards and I smiled.
Well done.
And it has this very like it moves at a very consistent pace.
I don't agree about the distortion. I will say I did say the distortion's actually, and I've seen them live a few times. It's actually massive. They've just cut it off in such an interesting way that it sounds. It's kind of furious, but like somebody shouting at you from very far away, you know, like across a field or something. But they're like absolutely livid.
Yeah.
Anyway, so go ahead.
And so I think it gets a bit of disservice from me because that is something that I like. You know me at this point in my music taste, I like something very simple and easy to access, and that will often change my mood in that moment very rapidly. And so it doesn't do that.
Yeah, this is definitely not simple.
Without. Yeah, you need to muse on it. But like that said, like there are like. There's obviously a bunch of songs on here that I do like a lot, and I think Demons is one of the ones that I like the most. I think the one of the reasons I really like this is because it feels like he just put a little bit more into the vocals, and they became more of a center point to the song, as opposed to it being this kind of blanket. And at times this sounded like a David Bowie song to me. The way he
I don't know if Fran's going to allow that.
Well, yeah, I like Demons. You know, Bowie's done so many different types of music that you know most people can have a song that sounds a bit like him.
Yeah. And I think consistently throughout, I think where he like pushed his vocals a little bit more, that's where I really started to engage more. And so I think Something for the Weekend was another one I really liked from that regard. And then as it progressed and you got the weirder electronic stuff, I actually really enjoyed that as well. So like Slow Life, where you had the like weird alien-like synths.
Yep.
It sounded that I really enjoyed that as well because it was very different. They encompass a lot.
Yeah.
And so it was hard. I found it hard to like have one set of feelings about this as a whole.
Yeah, I think that's the interesting thing with these playlists sometimes, isn't it? Is when you're looking at a band like this or like the Horrors, whose career's been really quite varied. It's a little hard sometimes to even though it's good to see someone's career like that and get a snapshot of it, it is also hard to sort of sometimes get a full handle on it. I think, which is interesting.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
I can see that.
But yeah, so I think I'm really glad that I had the opportunity, especially like that's one of the benefits of this playlist is I get a curated list of some of the best stuff that an artist is producing.
Bloody ages as well, Jesus.
Yeah.
Too lucky.
The next playlist I've been racking over for a while, trying to get it right, and I appreciate the sentiment that goes into it. And there's a lot I really like on this, and I'm glad I had a bit of time.
One thing that I didn't really get to reflect on, although there's only a couple of tracks I think that somewhat do so, is the live show for this band. an old friend of mine who's really into them as well, recommended that I put a live version of Man Don't Give a Fuck, which is a single they did early on about Howard Marks, I think it is. And it's I didn't put it on because it has about 5 minutes of just people screaming. We don't give a fuck about anybody at all. Just keeps going round and round and round. Now that's not going to work on this playlist, so fair enough. But it was a pity in a way. I felt that I couldn't really reflect with you both on how mental the live show is, and how Something for the Weekend is a good example of one of the more like clearly live types songs that would adapt well to the live environment, you know.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's a pity that they're not around to be seen as a band right now, because I think that live show is something to behold, really. So yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I did get that sense though.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Okay. They're not together anymore. Gruff's doing solo stuff. I don't know when he last did one, maybe 18 months ago.
Yeah, I listened to that, yeah.
And then, but no, the band are not working together anymore. I don't think they ever actually formally broke up, but they're not working together at the moment, I don't think. Okay. So yeah. And they did like 7 or 8 albums or something, and the last one, as I say, just wasn't as good as the others. So I feel like maybe they had a fantastic run. You know, maybe that's that. Yeah. You know. Okay, so
maybe they need to get together and go out on a high.
Absolutely, that's the better plan. Absolutely.
Well, maybe if they listen, they'll do that now that you've said that, Matt.
Yeah, they're here right now. Yeah. They're with us right now. Yeah. So yeah, thank you. Thank you for all the work you've done for us, Gruff, etc. All right, so we'll finish up there. So I just wanted to see. So I think Matt is hosting next time. Is that right?
Yes.
That is correct.
Yeah. So our next time picks. I'm doing Bright Eyes, Down in the Weeds Where the World Once Was, and Deftones Oms.
You've chosen like the longest title and the shortest title of all time.
Yeah.
What am I picking? I'm picking Alicia Keys with Alicia, I believe, or Keys, one of the two. And Sufjan Stevens with The Ascension.
Cool. And so for a classic, we're going to be doing Woody Guthrie with Dust Bowl Ballads. And then I'm going to be making a Dizzy Rascal playlist.
Dizzy Rascal.
Okay, nice.
Excited. I'm excited.
Nice. All right, wicked. So that's that, I think. All that's left to say is please go and check out our various ways to connect, our social media, etc., which is, Fran's going to tell you now because I never do.
Picky Bastards, capital B on Twitter, at The Picky Bastards on Facebook, and obviously the website is pickybs.com. Lots of reviews, lots of interviews, lots of articles, lots of people moaning about music and being nice about music.
Occasionally being nice, mostly just moaning. Yeah, but it's fun moaning. So yeah. Okay, that's that, I think. Thanks a lot then. We'll see you next time, I suppose.
See you next time.
Bye.